From the world's youngest serial killer, who murdered 3 people within a single year, to little kids with deadly intentions, these are the most evil kids in the world. Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser. In May 2014, 2 children, both aged 12, devised a devious plan to murder another 12-year-old girl by the name of Peyton Leutner.
Do you feel like you're a survivor?
Yeah, I shouldn't be alive. I really shouldn't after what happened.
Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser lured their friend Leutner into the woods following a sleepover.
New developments in the Slender Man case. One of the 2 girls who stabbed a classmate to please a fictional horror character has now been sentenced for the crime. And ABC's Lindsay Davis is here with the latest.
Where she was stabbed 19 times.
Do you remember leaving the park to go to the woods?
They just wanted to go on a walk, and I didn't think much of it. It's just a walk. It's in Waukesha,
The 2 culprits would later reveal to investigators that their actions had been an attempt to present an offering to the Slender Man, a fictional internet character whom they believed would murder their families otherwise. Weier and Geyser had enrolled at Horning Middle School alongside Leutner in the fall of 2013. The 2 girls were socially isolated, and their only solace was 12-year-old Leutner. Around this time, a friend introduced Weier to a diabolical horror fan site known as Creepypasta, where users would create fake encyclopedia entries about fictional monsters. The most popular of them all was the Slender Man, a tall, faceless entity, which the little girl came to love and revere.
I did search her iPad. I did watch over her shoulder.
Do you feel responsible?
I think on some level I'll always feel responsible for not knowing that my daughter wasn't well.
As she delved deeper into the world of horror fantasies, her naive mind became entwined in this fictional figure, so much so that she began to believe that the Slender Man actually existed. Along the line, Geyser also became obsessed with the character and often claimed to have engaged in private, telepathic conversations with him. In late December 2013, both Geyser and Weier began plotting the murder of Leutner so as to become proxies of the Slender Man. To these girls, offering this sacrifice was not just a pleasure, but a necessity. For 6 months, Geyser and Weier worked out the details of their evil plans without ever revealing their intentions to anyone. On May 30th, 2014, all the girls came together to celebrate with Geyser, who was turning 12. It was a momentous occasion, but for Geyser and Weier, this was the perfect opportunity to attain the highest heights imaginable. The following morning after the sleepover, the 2 girls executed their devious plan, luring Leutner into the woods and brutally stabbing her. They then left Leutner covered in a pool of her own blood and fighting for her life. Luckily, she survived and was able to crawl to the edge of the road, where a biker found her writhing in pain. The innocent girl was quickly taken to the hospital, and health officials worked hard to save her life. She eventually survived and was out of the hospital just a week after the incident. At the same time, the police launched a search for these 2 young criminals, who seemed to have vanished into thin air. They would later be found sitting in the grass near the interstate.
I asked her to show me her hands. I noticed there was some staining on her sweatshirt.
Interrogation in general is very difficult to watch.
Is she dead?
I don't know. She went to take her to the hospital.
That's not my daughter saying those things. That's not the way that she speaks. That's not the way that she acts.
It was like looking at a different child.
Yes.
The second half of their plan involved walking for hundreds of miles to the Nicollet National Forest in northern Wisconsin, where they believed the Slender Mansion was located. Their greatest desire was to find this beloved Slender Man and slide into his cold embrace as his humble and loyal minions. Both Geyser and Weier were charged with attempted first-degree homicide, but they would not be treated with kids' gloves. In March 2015, the judge in charge of the case considered the brutality of their crimes and decided to try them as adults. During the trial proceedings, a mental evaluation revealed a schizophrenic diagnosis for Geyser. As it was later revealed, her father, Matthew, had also suffered the same fate as an adolescent.
Not to the point where we saw any major concerns.
She was subsequently transferred to a mental hospital to receive appropriate treatment, and in August 2016, she pleaded not guilty because of insanity. But before she could go before a jury, Geyser reached a deal with prosecutors and pleaded guilty in September 2017. With this new deal, Geyser is scheduled to remain within the confines of the facility for a maximum term of 40 years. On the other hand, there's Anissa Weier, who had also initially pleaded not guilty by reason of mental defect in September 2016. In September 2017, after a jury found her not guilty by reason of mental disease, she was subsequently sentenced to 25 years at the Winnebago Mental Institute in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. However, a new development arose in July 2021 after the judge ruled that Weier no longer posed a threat to herself or others and granted her conditional release from the mental health facility. She must, however, remain under around-the-clock GPS monitoring and be under the careful watch of special case managers until she turns 37. The GPS stipulation was eventually lifted on September 12, 2023, giving Weier a level of freedom she had not enjoyed since the 2014 incident. Amarjeet Seda. This is Amarjeet Seda, also known as the world's youngest serial killer. By the time Amarjeet turned 10, he had been responsible for 3 separate murders between just 12 months. One of them was his baby sister. Amarjeet Seda was born in the small farming town of Begusarai in the state of Bihar, India. However, apart from his age and a few tiny details, most of his information was kept out of public records due to his age. In 2006, Amarjeet's aunt visited the family in their home, accompanied by her 6-year-old daughter. After the adults left the home, leaving the 7-year-old Amarjeet alone with his cousin, he began unleashing hell on the innocent child. First, he started hitting her, laughing maniacally as the baby cried. When this was not enough, he began strangling her. To crown it all, he took her into the neighboring woodlands, where he brutally hit her with a brick before burying her lifeless body under the grass. The most astonishing thing, however, was the fact that the boy eventually confessed to his family. But his parents offered no judgment to young Amarjeet, and the case was swept under the carpet. This would lead to another incident in less than a year later. This time around, it was Amarjeet's own sister who would become the victim of his vicious attack. This young murderer took his baby sister from her bed and proceeded to strangle her to death. Once again, he confessed the crimes to his mother, who still decided to cover up the crime, further empowering this sadistic little boy. Neighbors also started taking notice of this criminal behavior, and many people started keeping their kids away from the family. But Amarjeet's parents begged the neighbors not to inform the authorities about the deadly pattern, and so the case was once again swept under the carpet. Shortly after, Amarjeet committed his 3rd heinous crime, murdering another 6-month-old infant called Khushbu. Amarjeet, who is now 9 years old, had spotted the baby sitting in a stroller at the local school. The baby's mother had left the baby on the school grounds under the assumption that she would be safe, but no child was safe around Amarjeet. Without any regard or remorse, this sadistic little boy strangled and hit the baby repeatedly before burying her in a shallow grave. After returning to where the baby was supposed to be, Khushbu's mother found only an empty stroller. A search party quickly dispersed around the area looking for the baby. Witnesses began to come forward, claiming that they had seen Amarjeet with the baby. When officers questioned the boy, the revelation they uncovered was shocking. Without displaying any emotion whatsoever, Amarjeet admitted that he had indeed taken the baby, hit her, strangled her, and murdered her. He took the officers to the makeshift grave where he buried the remains, and the officers were astounded. It was like a scene from a horror film. The young murderer was arrested and an investigation was launched into his activities. It was then that news of his other murders began to appear on the headlines. This was a story India had never heard before. A 10-year-old unremorseful serial killer. Quite chilling. However, according to the Indian Constitution, it's unlawful to try a child as an adult or send a kid to prison. This meant that Amarjeet couldn't really pay for his crimes. The young murderer was sent to a home for juveniles and kept in solitary confinement, where he wouldn't be able to harm other kids. By the time he turned 18, Amarjeet was released from the correctional facility, although some sources claim he got out at the age of 16. He was given a new identity, started a new life, and careful steps have taken to ensure that he will never be found nor identified. Joshua Phillips.
And that sentencing hearing for teen killer Josh Phillips was an emotional one, and it just wrapped up.
The city of Jacksonville, Florida was thrown into turmoil on November 3, 1998, after an 8-year-old girl by the name of Maddie Clifton was reported missing. An Amber Alert was instantly put out as authorities worked around the clock to locate Maddie's body before something really terrible happened. Officers also began compiling a list of possible suspects. The first person on their list was Maddie's neighbor, a man who had been arrested and charged for 2 battery cases 15 years prior. Although both charges were dropped, police were still careful not to rule him out as a possible culprit. Maddie's parents launched an extensive campaign to uncover the location of their sweet baby girl, even offering a reward of $100,000 to whoever could help them solve the case. They put out signs, got help from the media, and did everything they could, but their baby was nowhere to be found. As it would later turn out, Maddie's abductor was also a neighbor, but not who everyone expected it to be. It was another neighbor, Melissa Phillips, who finally cracked the case open. Melissa was casually cleaning the room of her 14-year-old son, Joshua Phillips, when she noticed his waterbed was leaking. But when she inspected the bed, Melissa couldn't believe her eyes.
The judge will now take time to determine whether to keep Phillips in prison for life for the 1998 murder of 8-year-old Maddie Clifton in Jacksonville, or as the defense wants, sentence him to 40 years plus 5 years probation, including his time already served.
Carefully tucked underneath was Maddie's corpse, hidden in her very own house. Melissa immediately alerted the police and informed them that the murderer they were looking for was her son. Joshua was at school when the discovery was made, and when the police came for him, he knew things weren't looking good. The whole community was chilled to the bones. How could a mere 14-year-old perpetrate such a heinous crime? The young boy had no history of violence, and no one wanted to believe he was capable of carrying out such cold-blooded murder. But Joshua knew he was guilty of the crime and immediately confessed to the murder. However, he claimed it all began with an accident. According to Josh, they had both been playing together when he accidentally hit Maddie in the head with a baseball bat. Driven by intense panic, he claimed to have carried her into the house, brought her into his bedroom, and put her on the floor. Maddie was still very much alive at this point, but she was crying and making a whole lot of noise. Joshua claimed he was afraid of what his father's reaction would be if he came back to find Maddie in the house. To prevent himself from getting into trouble for hurting Maddie, Josh decided to finish the job. He picked up the baseball bat and delivered deadly strikes after strike. Then he proceeded to stab the little girl, all in a bid to stop her from screaming and crying. During investigations, police were able to retrieve both the bat and the knife used in the assault. As the search for Maddie intensified, Josh just casually kept the whole thing out of his mind. He claimed he was in denial and couldn't believe he had done something so grievous. So he decided to stick to his fantasy world, convincing himself that it was all just a bad dream.
Through the entire time, I was putting myself in a fantasy world that nothing would happen.
But actions have consequences, and even though he was just a little kid, Joshua would have to pay for his evil deeds. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of 8-year-old Madeline Clifton, and due to the severity of his crimes, he was tried as an adult. The story quickly became a media sensation, and the trial had to be moved out of Jacksonville due to the heavy media presence that rocked the city. Joshua was eventually found guilty and convicted of first-degree murder. However, due to the fact that he was under the age of 16 when the crime was committed, Florida laws exempted him from the death penalty. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. Since the trial, Maddie's mother has been seeking a new trial in an attempt to reduce the charge and, by extension, the sentence. In 2002, Joshua's appeal case was thrown out of court and his conviction was upheld. However, the case would get a breath of new life in 2012 after the U.S. Supreme Court made a ruling that sentencing juveniles to a mandatory life sentence without parole was unconstitutional. At last, it seemed Josh would be getting a new lease on life, but the blood on his hands cried out for vengeance, and his life sentence was once again upheld in 2017. His latest attempt at an appeal was in 2020, and although his case was once again thrown out, the appellate court noted that Joshua's life sentence would be reviewed again at a 25-year review, based on the demonstrated maturity and rehabilitation.
This truly is one of those rare cases where the life in prison sentence is warranted.
Based on the original 1999 sentencing, the review date should occur in 2024. Now in his late 30s, Joshua Phillips is currently incarcerated at Tomoka Correctional Institute in Daytona Beach, Florida. Lionel Tate. Born Lionel Alexander Tate on January 30th, 1988 in Broward County, Florida, this young boy set the record as the youngest person in the United States to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Back in 1999, when Lionel was just 12 years old, he found himself on the wrong side of the law for the brutal murder of a 6-year-old girl, Tiffany Unick. It all started on July 28, 1999 in Pembroke Park, Florida, when Lionel's mom, Kathleen Grossett Tate, was asked to watch Tiffany for the evening. Kathleen and Tiffany's mom were close friends who had grown up together in Jamaica. After having dinner, Kathleen left the children to go upstairs for the evening. But while Kathleen was away, something sinister was going on downstairs. Around 10:40 p.m., Lionel ran upstairs to get his mother, claiming that Tiffany had mysteriously stopped breathing. Frantic and panic-stricken, Kathleen rushed downstairs where he found Tiffany with several bruises all over her body. According to Lionel, he had simply been practicing some wrestling moves he saw on TV with the little kid.
He was play fighting with her and didn't understand that it could lead to her death.
In grueling details, he described putting her in a headlock before smashing her head on the side of the table. He then claimed that Tiffany began rolling around on the floor, crying, writhing in pain, and even urinating in her pants. He decided to go back to watching TV, but when he would later check on the baby, she wasn't breathing, and her broken little body was already cold. The police were called in, and both Lionel and his mother were pulled in for questioning. However, Lionel's story didn't really add up. According to experts, the injuries on Tiffany's body weren't consistent with a kid imitating wrestling moves. This was simply a brutal beatdown, which left Tiffany with 35 serious injuries. She had a cracked skull, a broken rib, a lacerated liver, a hemorrhaged kidney, bleeding in her brain, and a host of other bruises on her little body. The claim was further confirmed by a child abuse expert who testified that the violent beating must have lasted just 5 minutes, and the intensity was equal to a fall from a 3-story building. Prior to the murder, Lionel's record wasn't exactly clean. Although he was a bright young boy with an average IQ, he was quite prone to violence. In school, Lionel had built up a reputation for violence. He exhibited several behavioral problems, including stealing, lying, and fighting. These constant issues had him suspended from school 15 times, so the signs were there. In 2001, Lionel Tate was charged with Tiffany's murder, and even though he was 14 at the time, he was tried as an adult. Although the prosecution did not believe there was intent or premeditation, the case still fell under felony murder because it was the result of aggravated child abuse. To offer an easy way out, the prosecution offered Lionel a plea deal to a lesser charge of second-degree murder, which would only attract a lesser punishment of 3 years in prison and 10 years probation. However, Lionel's mother turned down the deal, and the case went to trial.
Time and time again, until it was time to give Lionel Tate what he wanted and had a right to as a person charged with murder in our country. And we had a trial.
After just 2 weeks of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict: guilty as charged. The conviction echoed through the courtroom and sent shockwaves through the community. For his crime, Lionel would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. His evil deeds were grievous, and so was his punishment. As the judge delivered the verdict, tears rolled down his cheeks, but it was too late now, and justice had to be served. But that's not where the story ends. In 2003, Lionel Tate got a second chance. An appeal court threw out his conviction on the basis that he wasn't given a mental competency hearing before his trial. He then pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and instead of going back to trial, he was handed the same deal he had turned down 3 years earlier. He was credited for the 3 years he had already served in the juvenile facility, which was followed by a year of house arrest, 10 years probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. In January 2004, Lionel walked out of jail a free man, but with a monitoring device attached to his ankle. But Lionel didn't learn from his mistakes. In September 2004, he was caught by police outside his home with a knife, leaving the judge no choice but to extend his probationary period to 15 years. He didn't stop there, though. In May 2005, Lionel was charged with armed robbery, armed burglary with battery, and violating his parole for his role in the robbery of a pizza man at gunpoint. Now he was back in court, before a judge who would show no mercy. This time, he was handed a sentence of 30 years in prison and is currently holed up behind bars, paying for his evil deeds.